Hello everyone and welcome to another HAES reading group nominee. We only have 2 more after this video. We are down to our last 3 and then I will start the polling. So let's just jump into it. I have always been fat. Not chubby or fluffy or husky or curvy. Fat. As I write this, I weigh 342 pounds and wear a woman's size 26. My body mass index, BMI, describes my body as super morbidly obese or extremely obese. Although my body is not the fattest in existence, it is the fattest the BMI can fathom. 3 years ago, I weighed just over 400 pounds and wore a size 30 or 32, depending on the cut of the clothing. At my high school graduation, I wore a red wrap top in the highest size I could find at the time, a woman's 24. For me, the size of my body is a simple fact. I do not struggle with self-esteem or negative body image. I do not lay awake at night longing for a thinner body or some life that lies 100 pounds out of reach. For me, my body isn't good or bad, it just is. But for the rest of the world, it seems, my body presents major problems. Friends, family, strangers, and coworkers alike offer unsolicited diet advice and recommend bariatric surgeons. Other shoppers pick over my cart at the grocery store, freely removing items they don't think I should eat. Doctors refuse to treat me, and some offices set weight limits on the patients they'll see, weight limits that my body reliably exceeds. I pray I do not need an MRI or a CAT scan, not because of the complex and frightening health troubles those tests may illuminate, but because I likely will not fit into the equipment's narrow tunnels and fixed walls. Strangers tell me, both online and in person, that my body is a death sentence and that every bite I take is a step toward a slow suicide. When I drive, disembodied shouts often echo from passing cars. Get out and try walking for a change. These days, I mostly leave my windows rolled up. If you're driving down, because there have been people I've heard shouting at cars. I don't know if they were shouting at me or whatever, but when you're driving by with your windows down, you can't really make out what people are saying unless you're driving very, very slow. So I question this, especially since you say it's from other passing cars. And it's not like you're stopped at a stoplight, like you're saying they're passing cars. This sounds like projection to me. But moving on. Bodies like mine are seen by others as an open invitation to express disgust, fear, and insidious concern. They are seen as an invitation to laugh, a prop for hackneyed would-be comics to recite the same punchlines over and over again. They are fodder not just for cruel teenagers or overgrown adult bullies, but for everyone. Loved ones tut-tut when they see me reach for a second helping of anything, anxious that I may think myself deserving of as much food as them. The bulk of the anti-fat attitudes I have faced have come at the hands of thin people who deeply believed they were doing right and doing good, emboldened by a culture that wholeheartedly agreed with them. So the thing about second helping of anything deserving as much food as them, here's the thing, a lot of people don't go for seconds. Part of my problem is portion size when it comes to food. I'm learning to only take one serving of whatever, because oftentimes that's all I need, and the second serving that I'm going for is because it tastes good. I'm not always successful in this, but I've learned that at least if I go for a second helping, take anything that I would take and cut it in half, and that's helping, and I'm trying to work down to only having one serving of something and being satisfied with that, because it's not really a matter of being hungry anymore. They're saying I don't deserve as much food as they do. Are they really taking as much food as you are? I mean, in all honesty, that's not to be cruel, but you kind of have to be aware of your own serving sizes. Because through this weight loss process, I'm learning that I take entirely too big a portion. In books, political cartoons, films, and TV shows, fat bodies make up the failings of America. Capitalism, beauty standards, excess, and consumerism. Fat bodies represent at once the poorest of the poor and the pinnacle of unchecked power, consumption, and decay. Our bodies have borne the blame for so much. Whole artistic worlds are built on the premise that bodies like mine are monstrous, repulsive, and worst of all, contagious. From individuals to institutions, academia to evening news, fat people are made boogeymen. And that spills into daily experiences of abuse driven by intentions both good and ill, but always with the same outcome, an intense shame for simply daring to exist in the bodies many of us have always had. There is a minefield of abuse reserved for the very fat. I have come to view the world through the prism of that abuse, negotiating my days around reducing it. Who will shout at me? Which doctor will refuse to see me? Which dates will mock my body? Which strangers will photograph me, make a meme of my skin? I avoid eye contact with strangers, knowing that our locking eyes are too often misconstrued as an invitation to shout or detail their judgments of my body. I deploy a charm offensive, calming agitated aggressors before they get the chance to unleash their fury. I have learned how to keep abusers at bay alone, knowing that no one else will intervene to support or defend me. I've developed this sad and necessary skill set because in my soft and certain marrow, I know that the abuse faced by fat people is not understood to warrant a reckoning. But the most difficult part of anti-fat attitudes isn't bullying, harassment, fear, or violence. I have come to expect epithets and aggression have come to weather their heat and pressure. But I have never become accustomed to the complete lack of empathy from so many around me. As a white queer woman, describing the challenges I may face from misogyny and homophobia may be difficult, but it's increasingly met with some measure of sympathy. But when I disclose the abuse I have faced as a fat person, I am frequently met with a steely refusal to believe it. Did you do something to aggravate them? Maybe they thought they were helping. They were probably just concerned for your health. When anti-fatness turns institutional, as with staggeringly prevalent employment discrimination or punitive airline policies, others' responses curdle, turning from indifference to outright defense. Suddenly, people who otherwise relish complaining about delayed flights and cramped legroom become airline staunchest defenders. Okay, but that's because I think you said you were 342 pounds, right? So, it's not that people are defending how frustrating that may be for you, but most people recognize that it is unfair to expect airlines, and what was the other one that they said? Employment discrimination. Because most people kind of understand that viewpoint, because if you're 342 pounds, you may not be able to do the job as effectively as someone who's thinner. You may not be able to do it to the degree that it needs to be done. And when it comes to the airline policies, airlines do based on the average, and you are well outside of that. Like, there's a big difference between people hurling harassment and abuse at you, and I'm not saying that I don't think that doesn't happen. I do think that that happens, and it's wrong that it happens, but the problem is that just from this little bit alone, it's all victimhood. It is 110% victimhood. Like, there's no... The big difference between this and you facing misogyny as a woman or homophobia as a queer person is that you can't change those two things about yourself, but you can change your weight. So that's where a big difference comes in. People who don't wear plus sizes may struggle to hear the severity and irrationality of anti-fat abuse and bias. It may be difficult to believe, even unfathomable, that there's a world so different from their own. But anti-fat bias has always been there, as noxious and ubiquitous as polluted air. Still, thinner people aren't forced to reckon with it. As ubiquitous as it may be, for many thinner people, anti-fatness doesn't present a barrier to healthcare, employment, transportation, or meeting other basic needs. Life in a thinner body means the world is redacted, presented only in part. The depth and breadth of anti-fatness can be difficult to believe, too, because anti-fatness attitudes, comments, policies, and practices are ubiquitous. We cannot see the air we've been breathing for years, cannot touch the shifting ground beneath our feet. Anti-fatness has become invisible, a natural law. To many people who don't wear plus sizes, objecting to fat hate is as irrational as debating gravity. Why waste outrage on a simple fact of the world we live in? The thin Greek chorus in my life when faced with the ubiquitous sharp edges of fat hate, have too readily insisted that you can't change the world, you can only change yourself, by which they meant me. I mean, to a certain extent, that is true, though. I mean, with how many issues that the fat acceptance people have with everything, to a certain extent, you have to accept that you can change yourself, but you can't necessarily change the world. Like, especially with things like prevalence of sizing in clothing at, like, the mall, or people posting before and after pictures. There's things that are just outside of your control, and if you don't like it, then you kind of have to change yourself to fit in it, especially since you have the full capability of changing yourself to fit in it. And I don't say that to be cruel, but everyone has something to fight for, especially right now. It seems like there's just issue upon issue upon issue. And when you look at those issues, your anti-fat rhetoric shit that you go on about is low man on the totem pole, because there are more serious issues at hand. Again, though, I don't think that people like this deserve to be shouted at or have cruelty lobbed their way. I'm just saying that they expect a lot from people when they could potentially fix a lot of their issues. For the most part, our woefully limited cultural conversation about fat people backs them up. Fatness is reliably demonized, discussed only in the context of how not to be fat, weight loss, or how fat will kill us immediately, the obesity epidemic. Fat experiences are only shared to contrast a more real story from a thin person, or as a pitiable and wretched reality to conjure thin gratitude. Fat people are frequently spoken about or at, but we're rarely heard. Instead, bodies and experiences like mine become caricatured and symbolic, either as a kind of effigy or as a pornography of suffering. Bodies and experiences like mine are rarely allowed to just be ours. In recent years, a growing number of fat memoirs have joined the fold, but this book isn't that. It isn't a memoir of fat pain that will offer thin people comfort or relief that they're not that fat. It isn't another entry in the canon of books about the perils of being fat or the frightening specter of the obesity epidemic. It isn't a weight loss book. You won't read about my longing for a thinner body or the lengths I'll go to in order to lose weight. This book will not reassure you that at least she's trying to lose weight. It is not rooted in the near ubiquitous cultural dogma that fat people are duty-bound to become thin before asking to be treated with respect and dignity. This book diverges from the well-trod path when it comes to fatness and fat people. In it, you'll find a mix of memoir, research, and cultural criticism, all focused on unearthing our social and cultural attitudes towards fat people, along with the impacts those attitudes can have on fat people, ourselves. Where our cultural conversation focuses relentlessly on personal responsibility and the perceived failures of fat people, this book seeks to zoom out, offering personal stories while simultaneously identifying the macro, social, institutional, and political forces that powerfully shape the way each of us thinks of fat people, both in general and in particular. In recent years, the long-standing body positivity movement has taken center stage, focused on in talk shows and sitcoms utilized by the magazines and advertisers that for so long weaponized the images of very thin bodies against so many of us. This may seem like a potent force for fat justice and liberation. It is not. While the modern body positivity movement has deep roots in the fat acceptance and fat liberation movements, its most recent wave of popularity owes its success to two women who don't wear plus sizes, Connie Subissac, an author, and Elizabeth Scott, a licensed clinical social worker, founded an organization called The Body Positive in 1996. This person had personally struggled with an eating disorder, and Scott specialized in treating them. The organization's mission is simple. The Body Positive teaches people how to reconnect to their innate body wisdom so they can have more balanced, joyful self-care and a relationship with their whole selves that is guided by love, forgiveness, and humor. The Body Positive trains its members to build 5 core competencies: reclaim health, practice intuitive self-care, cultivate self-love, declare your own authentic beauty, and build community. Given the founder's background in eating disorder recovery work, the Body Positive's stated goal and framework make a lot of sense. Many eating disorder survivors, fat and thin, struggle with low self-esteem, insufficient self-love, and reckoning with their body image enough to declare their own authentic beauty. The broader body positivity movement has run with that framework too, focusing its work on building self-esteem and positive body image. Its rise has certainly been a net gain for many, opening up spaces to talk about our relationships with our bodies and the insecurities we may grapple with is a significant step forward. For survivors of eating disorders and body dysmorphic disorder, body positivity has been a true lifeline for their mental health and recovery. Like thin people, fat people can struggle with body image and self-esteem, but unlike thinner people, that's only the start of our body-related challenges. As you will read in the pages ahead, fat people face overwhelming discrimination in employment, healthcare, transit, the treatment of eating disorders, and more. While body image is certainly a piece of the puzzle for fat people, it is a relatively small one. While the body positivity movement's aims are laudable, there's simply a solution for a very small part of a much larger looming problems faced by fat people, especially fat people at the larger end of the plus-size spectrum. By the numbers, while body positivity may be increasing individual self-esteem, it doesn't seem to have made a dent in the prevalence of anti-fat attitudes and behaviors. Harvard University analyzed results from its framed implicit bias tests, looking at data from those who took its test between 2007 and 2016. During the precipitous rise of the body positivity movement, they found that implicit bias was on the decline in nearly every category. According to Harvard's lead researcher on the study, anti-fat bias has changed the most slowly of all explicit stated attitudes. And when it comes to implicit bias, that is, the bias we unconsciously act on, anti-fatness is getting significantly worse. It is the only attitude out of the 6 that we looked at that showed any hint of getting more biased over time. While body positivity seems to be everywhere, it doesn't appear to be changing our deeply held, deeply harmful belief about fatness and fat people. The rise of body positivity has also led to extremely challenging dynamics within the movement. Because body positivity is so deeply focused on internal individual change, conversations about power, privilege, and oppression often don't come naturally to self-proclaimed body positive people. When people in more marginalized bodies, particularly fat people, disabled people, transgender and non-binary people, and people of color request conversations that grapple with the thornier realities of our lives, which are formed more by other people's behaviors than our own internal self-image, those requests are often roundly rejected by many body positive activists. Okay, but wait just a second. You said that the only one that was increasing was anti-fatness. So that means of the other measured categories, granted I'm not 100% sure what they are, but that I see this is another thing where they seem to be pulling other marginalized groups to lift themselves up rather than trying to make any decent claim on their own. Right now, this whole thing reads just as a poor me spiral to me. All I've heard is about how the hardship she's faced and how everything is against her. Everything is against her. I'm getting tired just reading this. And I don't actually mean that. I think this could be a very fun thing to react to. I think it would need to be paired with something else. I don't dislike it though. I don't dislike the possibility of reading this. But right now all she's talking about is like poor me, poor me, poor me, poor me. Everyone's against me. I'm oppressed. I experience oppression on the daily. And it's just more shit that we've heard before. And I'd be interested in going through this book and kind of picking it apart. And I think that perhaps we could pair this with another book maybe that might help flesh out some perspectives. When fat people open up about our experiences, thinner body-positive activists often rewrite those accounts of institutional discrimination and interpersonal abuse as insecurities, whitewashing the vast differences between our diverging experiences. Fat people who tag photos with body positive are regularly met with accusations of glorifying obesity or promoting an unhealthy lifestyle. Mainstream social media accounts still post before and after weight loss photos claiming body positive while celebrating bodies that look less fat. See, this, again, I fucking hate that argument of how somehow before and after photos are somehow oppressive to you. Like, you have officially lost me in any sympathy I had for you. I get so tired of them saying that you doing something on your own social media page that is nothing but you celebrating achieving a goal is somehow against them or oppressing them in some fucking way. The most recognized faces of body positivity, frequently models and actors, are disproportionately white or light-skinned, able-bodied, and either straight size, that is not plus size, or the smallest end of plus size. While it may not be an intentional one, for many fat activists, the message is clear. Body positivity isn't for us. Oh my god. Oh my god, the victimhood. This is so stupid. As a result, fat activists use a variety of terms to describe our work and distinguish it from the body positivity movement's larger interior focus on self-esteem. Some fat activists strive for body neutrality, a viewpoint that holds that bodies should be prized for their function, not their appearance, and that simply feeling impartial about our bodies would represent a significant step forward for those of us whose bodies are most marginalized. Others fight for fat acceptance, which seeks to counter anti-fat bias with a tolerance-based model of simply accepting the existence of fat people and ceasing our constant attempts to make fat bodies into thin ones. So that's a fun way of phrasing it, but oftentimes the more people that I see with fat acceptance say, down with the oppressive fucking thins. And calling people, anyone that tries to go on a diet, saying that they have an eating disorder. Maybe, I love how they're presenting this with a theoretical perspective of what fat acceptance is, because that's not the way that it's practiced. Some urge us towards body sovereignty, the concept that each person has the full right to control their own body. Fat activist frameworks are as varied as fat people ourselves, so I'd be curious to look into body sovereignty and see if they have different, because I actually don't mind this concept on its face, but I'd be interested to see how it works in practice, because if it's the concept that each person has the full right to control their own body, then you shouldn't be able to say shit about before and after photos. You shouldn't be able to say shit about people that want to go on a diet. So if that's how you feel, I can actually get behind that if it's as cut and dry as it's presented here, which I doubt it is. While these approaches work for many, I describe mine as work for fat justice. Body positivity has shown me that our work for liberation must explicitly name fatness as its battleground, because when we don't, each of us are likely to fall back on our deep-seated, faulty cultural beliefs about fatness and fat people, claiming to stand for all bodies while we implicitly and explicitly exclude the fattest among us. I yearn for more than neutrality, acceptance, and tolerance, all of which strike me as meek pleas to simply stop harming us, rather than asking for help in healing that harm or requesting that each of us unearth and examine our existing biases against fat people. Acceptance is a step forward, but it's a far cry from centering fat people's humanity in our cruel and ceaseless conversation about fat bodies. Oh my fucking god. A conversation about fat justice, though, will require so much of each of us. People who don't wear plus sizes will need to hear and believe fat people's experiences that may differ from their own so dramatically as to strain credulity. They will hear stories of strangers mooing from a passing car or passerby, throwing trash at fat people walking down a city street. They will hear stories of doctors telling their patients to stop shoving food in your face long enough to pay attention. Remarks like these are so deeply unkind that it's hard to imagine why someone would think they're acceptable to say out loud. But by the simple virtue of living in our bodies, fat people are seeing things straight-sized people can't yet. Things that only happen in the presence of bodies like ours. Straight-sized people will need to resist the urge to reject fat experiences out of hand because of a lack of context. Instead, they'll need to find the context. They'll need to look harder to sharpen their vision. They'll need to learn to see anti-fatness everywhere because it is. Anti-fatness may not make sense to straight-sized people. It doesn't make sense to me either, but straight-sized people's tasks will be threefold. Not to buckle under the weight of their own discomfort, to stay in the conversation long enough to learn, and to take proactive action to counter anti-fat bias and help defend fat people. Advancing fat justice will require a lot from fat people too. It will require us to take risks we've taken so many fruitless times before, the risks of sharing our most challenging experiences of anti-fat bias, of opening our bodies and lives up to even more public conversation and debate. Ours will be the work of courageous and frightening vulnerability, of holding a standard of humanity, dignity, and respect that so many tell us we simply do not deserve. And it will be the work of building a bold vision for a more liberated world, for fat people and for people of all sizes. My God, talk about martyrism, for fuck's sake. Honestly, they make themselves sound like martyrs, that they will have to endure this great vulnerability, this great violence to ultimately push society forward. I fucking hate this. I hate this thought process. If I hadn't burned all of my rage out on the Monday video, I would actually have more to say about this, but Megs for Fun took all of my rage today, and I don't have much left to spend on this. So perhaps next time I will do this first. Regardless of our size, working toward fat justice will call upon our most honest, compassionate selves. It will require deep vulnerability, candor, and empathy. Together, we can create a tectonic shift in the way we see, talk about, and treat our bodies, fat and thin alike. We can find more peace in the skin we live in, declaring a truce with the bodies that only try to care for us. But more than that, we can build a more just and equitable world that doesn't determine our access to resources and respect based on how we look. We can build a world that doesn't assume fat people are failed thin people, or that thin people are categorically healthy and virtuous. We can build a world that conspires against eating disorders and body dysmorphia, working toward more safety for eating disorder survivors of all sizes. We can build a world in which fat bodies are valued and supported just as much as thin ones. A Fat Justice Glossary. Throughout this book, you will read a number of terms that may not be familiar to you, or whose use you may struggle to embrace. Different fat activists may each offer their own definitions for these commonly used terms, so these definitions are far from universal. Here's how I defined and use them in the pages that follow. Fat, a neutral descriptor for predominantly plus-size people. While fat is frequently used to insult people of all sizes, blah, 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 blah. Smaller fat and very fat people. I am going to skip over some of these definitions because I think most of us already understand how it is, and it seems like the fat, it goes over synonyms, goes over how fat shouldn't be a bad word, talks about reclaiming it, blah, blah, blah. I just don't, we've gone over that with different books before. I just don't see the need to read that one out. Smaller fat people and very fat people. Different levels of fatness invite different experiences. People who wear smaller plus sizes, say a size 14 or 16 in the US, regularly hear comments about how they've got such a pretty face. You'd be a knockout if you just lost 20 pounds. But people who wear extended plus sizes, a size 34 for example, face open street harassment, hearing slurs and jeers from passing cars. Ash, the host of the Fat Lip podcast, something that we would totally check out if we chose to read this one, has established a framework for understanding and pinpointing these important gradations based on the U.S. women's clothing sizes. Small fat, 1X to 2X, sizes 18 and lower towards 00 to 1. Find clothes that fit in mainstream brands and can shop in many stores. Mid-fat 2X to 3X is sizes 20 to 24 toward 2 to 3. Shop at some mainstream brands, but mostly dedicated plus brands and online. Superfat 4X to 5X, sizes 26 to 32 toward 4 to 6, where the highest sizes of plus-size brands can often only shop online. Infinifat 6X XX and higher, sizes 34 and higher, some towards 6, very difficult to find anything that fits even online, often requires custom sizing. These gradations are frequently used within fat spaces to help pinpoint privileges, blah, blah, blah. I use smaller fat people to refer to small, mid-fats, very fat, and larger fat. Anti-fatness and anti-fat bias. Anti-fatness and anti-fat bias are umbrella terms that describe attitudes, behaviors, and social systems that specifically marginalize, exclude, underserve, and oppress fat bodies. More of this bullshit. Healthism. We know what healthism is. Stupid. Plus size clothing. We know what plus size clothing is. Extended plus size clothing, which we've already kind of determined it's for anything that's a 30 plus. Straight size clothing is 0 to 14. Obese and overweight, the BMI indicators. We know that. We know what diet culture is. And now we're into chapter 1. So sorry I kind of skipped over the glossary, but we know a lot of that, and I don't really, her definitions are very similar to other definitions that we've seen, and I don't think we really need to spend time going over them. So that is what we don't talk about when we talk about fat. That is the introduction. I think this is a possible very interesting look. I definitely think we would do the podcast if we chose to go with this one. I think it'll be more interesting if I can approach it with a fresher mind. Like I said before, I wasted a lot of my rage on the TikToks that we went over this week. So I don't have a whole lot of outrage to give this book at the moment. But if we did choose to cover this, I'd have more energy and more outrage for it, I think. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. I think that this one has a lot of potential. But I can't wait to hear from you guys, and I will see you next time.